I said I'd give you two stories. I had the one about the frogs. This is the second story about two lumberjacks. Now you need to set the scene because it's a tale of sort of David and Goliath, between the youthful and the strong and the old and the slightly more frail. I tried to think of two staff members. Now, lumberjack competitions tend to be male dominated, so I was limited by the number of male staff who I could, but I came up with and Mr. Stubbs, so Mr. Moore and Mr. Stubbs. You need to imagine Mr. Moore and Mr. Stubbs in the Great Y Forest Lumberjack Competition. If you don't know what a lumberjack competition is, I've got, hang on a second. So what you do with lumberjack, if you don't know what a lumberjack is, they basically have saws and axes. In the world of lumberjack competitions, it's basically who can chop down the most trees. It's not very environmentally friendly. Chop down the most trees in a given period of time. So in the White Forest, they happen to see each other across with all the entrants stood there at the start. And Mr. Moore, well, who wouldn't bet against Mr. Moore? He's useful, he's strong, he's the male staff member of choice. Everyone's cheering for Mr. Moore, and he sort of leers at Mr. Stubbs. And, I'm going to beat you. And Mr. Stubbs, being a gentleman and slightly more genteel by nature, doesn't rise to the challenge, and he goes off into the woods, ready for the horn that sounds the start of the competition. It's a long competition because you can't just get a saw. It takes a bit of time, doesn't it, to saw and chop things down. And so it's something that lasts 24 hours, so it's a pretty old, tiring thing. The whistle goes, the horn goes, and off they go into the woods with their saws and their axes. Mr. Stubbs disappears. Mr. Moore is frenetic. He feels, I've got 24 hours, and he sweats, and he beavers, and he swings his axe, and he saws his, the wood, the timber piles up around him. And every now and again, he sort of stops. Well, I can't hear that Mr. Stubbs in the other side of the forest. I bet he's really tired. And he's having a rest because he's that old, frail, I'll show it. And he goes and he keeps chopping. And he goes all through the night. And all through the next morning. And the sweat's dripping from him. Anyway, the next day comes, and Mr. Moore, all the other competitors, and Mr. Moore is looking pretty smug because he couldn't have given anything else. He'd listened out for Mr. Stubbs in the night, he'd listened during the day, and he wasn't at all confident that Mr. Stubbs at all was big enough, strong enough, youthful enough to beat him. And so the announcer gets on the microphone and says, in first place, and the winner of the 2021 annual lumberjack competition for the Y Forest is Mr. Stubbs. And Mr. Moore looks up and says, what on earth is going on? He said, I listened, and during the night there were pauses, and during the day I couldn't hear. Were you resting? You couldn't cope with my strength and my stamina. So what were you doing in those times? And he says, with that Mr. Stubbs wink and a wry smile, he says, Mr. Stubbs, I was taking time to make sure that my axe and my sword, my saw, were kept as sharp as possible. And so the moral of the story is this, is that if you spend your time without thinking about what you're doing and not taking time to have a rest and recover and just have a sense of direction and purpose, it doesn't actually matter how youthful or strong or actually how hard you work. Everybody needs a bit of a rest now and again to get their minds and their heads and their bodies ready.
Just to say a huge thank you to our guests this afternoon, Amy Dowling. To all those who have contributed musically or behind the scenes, all the performers who have delighted us with their music this afternoon, round of applause also for them. To all the award winners and the extended community of the school, which of course includes some terrific teachers and non-teaching staff, and that really is the whole school community. It's not us alone on here who make the magic happen. It's actually lots of people behind the scenes, behind computers, behind hoovers and goodness knows what else, making the school tick and go from one day to day. So a round of applause for the school, please. And again, this is my own tradition because mums and dads make a huge investment, children, boys, girls and young adults leaving school, a huge investment in your education, and very, very rarely do you remember, I think, to thank your mum and dad for getting you to where you are in your schooling life, and indeed where you are for super things to come when you leave here. So mums and dads, you can keep your hands in your lap. Boys and girls, young people, give your mums and dads a big round of applause.